Hello, Year 9, and so we're going to start with these starter questions. So we got bronze, silver, and gold. Bronze being what is yeast and what conditions does it require to work when making bread? Silver, name one function of flour in bread making and what flour is usually used in bread making, and we're going to look a little bit more into that during this lesson. And gold, can you explain the process of fermentation in yeast? So our learning objectives for this lesson are to know what gluten is and why it's important in bread making. So what is the purpose of gluten within bread making and where does it come from? How does it work, etc. We're also going to be able to conduct an experiment. So we're going to look into a gluten experiment. You're more than welcome to do it at home, and I have done a video for you to show how this experiment works, and we look at the results throughout the experiment that I did at home, showing the amount of gluten that is within different flours within bread making, and to also understand the function of gluten. So this word keeps cropping up: gluten, gluten, gluten. What is it? How does it work? And especially within bread making. That is the basic purpose of this lesson. There is a video you can watch online with America's Test Kitchen. Really good video and showing where gluten is within flour, and they really wash. They basically do a heightened version of what I'm going to do in terms of my experiment, but at least gives you an idea of a little bit more about what gluten is. In short, gluten is made up of a protein. So it's a protein that's found within flour. So you have flours, so like plain flour, self-raising flour, strong flour is what we're looking at. There are other like flours like wholemeal flour and so on, and it is present in there. So this gluten is basically a protein found in wheat flour. It's found in the grain of the wheat. And there are two, this gluten is split into two proteins known as gliadin and glutenin. So gliadin and glutenin are found in wheat flour, in like flour particles in the molecules of flour, and together they make this protein known as gluten. And the gluten is developed in the bread dough when it is being kneaded or when it's had water added to it. So once water has added to flour, and you get that doughy consistency like you can see in those pictures below, like that's how you get that doughy consistency, and that's when the gluten has been activated. That's when it starts to get stretchy and elastic, and you end up with all kinds of doughs and so on. Whether you're playing with it or not, in terms of the flour and the water, you will end up with a dough ball structure or a doughy structure, and that's the gluten forming essentially. So gluten within flour, again, so when you're making bread, flour with a high gluten content is used to provide the structure for bread. So when you're making bread, we use strong flour. If you can remember from year 8 when we did make flour, we make it again and again and again just to get that point across that that's the gluten that's working within that flour to help give that structure to bread. It's what holds the shape of bread. And it's what's holding all the gases that are being provided throughout fermentation when the yeast is working. And the best flour for bread making is strong flour. And you have all these different types of strong flour. I've picked out different ones from different supermarkets. There's one from Morrison's. You have the Allison strong flour bread, which is what I use. Very strong white flour from Tesco. Waitrose Canadian, very strong, and very strong organic bread flour from Dove's Farm. The list goes on, but this you can see on each one of those, they specify bread. So this gluten within the flour is very important when it comes to bread making, and again we delve into why. So strong flour is found in or used for bread. We need to get this across in terms of our learning in respect to bread. Needs to use strong flour. Now this strong flour comes from the wheat. So flour comes from wheat, which is ground down, and this particular hard wheat that is used to make strong flour, to make bread, comes from like colder climates. So you'll see on most flour packets that they'll have Canadian strong flour. So Canada and even our climate is great for this particular wheat because it's that colder climate which seems to produce this harder wheat, this harder grain, which has this higher gluten content, which has a better structure when you're making breads and so on. So the higher the gluten content, the better the bread, because it's keeping that structure. It's keeping the structure of the bread, because gluten helps with elasticity. And think of elastic bands. And enables bread doughs to rise with a good structure. So it's so I'm going to keep saying with holding its shape. So you imagine the yeast is working, it's fermenting within the flour, within the bread, and while that's giving off gases and CO2 and alcohol, sorry, it's fermenting, and the bread is holding in all those gases. It's holding in all those gases, so that as the bread is rising, as the bread is proving, it's just holding it in, but also holding the shape of the bread. Otherwise, if there was no elasticity, if there was no gluten, there would be escape. The CO2 would escape, and therefore it would lose its shape. You wouldn't have these lovely shapes of bread that we get. It would just be like, I don't know. I don't know what it would be like. It just wouldn't be nice to look at. Let's put it that way. So the gluten helps with the elasticity, keeping that shape of the bread and helping it to rise, helping those to keep the gases in while the fermentation process of yeast is happening. So I've added a clip that shows me doing this experiment, this gluten experiment, to show 3 different types of flour: your strong flour, your plain flour, and your self-raising flour. To show how much gluten is within each of those flours. So there's a certain amount of gluten within the flours. Which one has the highest? The highest amount of gluten surely should be the one, or is the one, that is best for the flour. So the objective is to carry out an experiment to investigate the gluten content in different types of flours. So the equipment I used: weighing scales, measuring jugs, plastic bowls, sieve, baking tray, baking parchment. The controls that I used: I preheated my oven to 200 degrees. I used digital scales because they're a lot more accurate. I measured the water on the scales. I measured the flour on the scales. So everything's being measured, everything's being weighed, so it's all controlled. There's no room for bias whatsoever. It's all a fair test. And the cooking time, as you'll see in the experiment, was 12 minutes. So these were my controls to make sure that it was a fair test, to make sure everything was the same, and that if it was to be done again, that the same outcome would appear. Again, as you'll see from my experiment, if you've not watched the video already, this is what I use. So I use 50 grams of each flour, so the strong flour, the plain flour, the self-raising flour, and I had 25 ml of water in each one, made it into a dough ball, and then weighed it, washed it, weighed it again, cooked it, and so on. But you'll see in the video that I made. But this is the investigation that you would be seeing when you would have been conducting it at the school. So there is a sheet that that is also available on the Show My Homework, and it's this particular one. It's the gluten experiment, for those that can see there. So your gluten experiment, that's your front page. So as we're going through that experiment, I would encourage you to work with me on it. So you're working through these sheets as I'm going through the experiment. When it comes to the hypothesis, this is where it's a guess. It's your thoughts on what you think will happen. So which sample do you think will be the most successful, and why? So when you've carried out your research about gluten, which we had a little bit of research at the beginning about gluten, which you're more than welcome to go away and research that a little bit more, please do. And then out of that, you can come out with a guess, an educated guess of which sample you would think would be the most successful and why, out of those 3 flours that are being used in the experiment. For example, there's an example there. I believe that plain flour worked the best in this experiment because it is used a lot in most recipes to help in cooking. There's one, I mean, it doesn't have to be the right answer. It's a guess. and then you judge it all towards the end. So as the experiment goes on, then you can justify it at the end. It's you basically working through it. It doesn't have to be the right answer. It's how a scientific process works in this experiment, and how all experiments in food work. So this is just part 2 of the investigation. So washing out, squeezing the dough ball under the running water until the water runs clear, and then you weigh it again, line it on the baking tray, and then cook it, label it, and then bake it for the 12 minutes. So keeping all those controls in place, making sure the investigation is being a fair test. We're making a fair test as we go. So investigation part 2. And then you're recording those results into the table. So the table again that you have here, this one came from my experiment that we did online on the video earlier. So those are my results that I got from this experiment, and I used the formula in there to demonstrate, well, which flour has the highest gluten content, which flour has the highest gluten content that would help towards bread making. So your results, or our results. So we're writing about the findings after the experiment. So which flour had the highest percentage of gluten? So I've done the experiment for you, so you can write it out on the sheet that I've attached for you. So which flour had the highest percentage of gluten? What do the samples feel like? So you can take an example of how I described each of those samples once they had been cooked. Comment on the size of each sample. Again, I commented on them as well. What do the samples look like inside? Well, what do they look like to you? You don't have to take my advice for it, but what do they look like to you? Using your sensory analysis, and how elastic does each one feel? Again, I went through that one, and what exactly is making it feel elastic? It's got to be the gluten. The gluten is making it feel elastic. That's what's giving it that stretch to keep those gases in once fermentation is happening within bread. So essentially, this is what I would like you to do. If you have not done the experiment in terms of following it along with the resource that I've given you, okay, fine. But then I would like this to be done. This is what I would like for the bulk of your homework or your work at home. I would like you to use full sentences and using your own words to help answer the following questions. Okay, so you can research online, you can go on Google, you can go on into books, other resources, newspapers, you name it, talk to someone about it that maybe might even know about this subject. That's fine. It's all research at the end of the day and all findings. But what I would like you to do is use full sentences, and then you're backing it up with because, or do you know what I mean? So you are explaining it further. It's not just a one-word answer. We need to get out of that cycle. So your questions here, this is for show my homework. This is what I would like you to get back to me with. Question 1, describing what you have learned about gluten. Describe what you have learned about gluten. Use full sentences. What have you learned about gluten from this lesson? How could you now describe gluten from what we have learned? So you're describing it. How can you describe it now, knowing from what you didn't know before this lesson and now you know or should know about gluten? What have you learned and how can you describe it? What flour has the highest amount of gluten? So that could be a one-word answer, but in a sentence, this flour contains the highest amount of gluten because, I don't know, you could throw a because in there. How is gluten activated in flour? So how does it become stretchy and elastic? Why is a high gluten flour used for making and cooking bread? Why do we need gluten when we're making and cooking bread? What is the purpose of it? Again, go back on the research that we were doing before, go back on this PowerPoint, go back on resources, have a little look through, research a little bit. It all goes towards it. And explaining why you would not use a high gluten flour for cakes and soft baked goods. So why is gluten not so good? So why aren't we using like bread flour for things like scones or cakes? Why aren't we doing that? Surely then you could just use a flour for anything. just pick a flour off the shelf and you can just use that. Why don't we do that? Why are there specific flours? And lastly, what is the disease called when some people cannot eat foods that contain gluten? So if you can't eat gluten, and we did do this in class in groups, and one group that was in this group, people that were in that group will go, I know that, or you should know that. So what's the disease called when some people cannot eat foods that contain a high amount of gluten or any gluten? And those are the questions there right now that I would like you to answer for Show My Homework. Thank you.